We are live. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're happy to have with us today C.S. Harris. He's going to be talking about the brand new book. Sorry, it's very shiny. What Cannot Be Said. And Candace signed a batch of books for us, as always. We appreciate that. And I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field, should you wish to purchase a copy. And if you have questions for the author, go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will bring me on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'll be happy to ask any of your questions. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick is downstairs because the sun coming in the west window of the store as we're climbing towards 90 degrees would have broiled him. So he's downstairs, where people are wandering around, but that's the way it is. Anyway, I'm really sorry that Candace is not here, but I'm delighted that we are able to connect through the magic of Zoom. So lovely to see you. And yeah, wonderful to have your new book, which I think has a really horrifying plot. But I always wonder how a really nice woman like you comes up with these perfectly awful scenarios. I wonder, what's your interior like? Do you wake up in the night and have dark thoughts, or what are you doing?
It's funny. This is an idea that came to me actually a few years ago, and I started writing it, and it just didn't feel right. So I shelved it for a few years, and then came back to it. Sometimes they come easily, sometimes they come in fragments. I honestly don't know where they come from.
Well, I always tell people that these are not Regency cozies. They are really wonderful, wonderful novels, pretty hard hitting and very much in tune. We think of the Regency as kind of, this Jane Austen wonderland, but in point of fact is we're winding up after Waterloo. England is not in great shape. The economy is shot. There are all kinds of, soldiers who've been wounded in this 20-year campaign, and nobody's taking care of them. It's a lot like when people came back from Vietnam in this country, right? So there's a lot of civil unrest and potential political upheaval.
We have a tendency to think that the war was over, so then everything was fine. But actually the situation continued to deteriorate because the economic policy of the government was to retire their debt as fast as they could. And so they had all of these economic problems, but they didn't want to spend the money to create any kind of social problems. So there was a lot of unrest, and there was a very real sense in the government at the time that they were closer to revolution than they had been at any time since 1789, because those kind of thoughts were still in the air. And actually things get worse the next year, in 1816, when the weather went crazy because of the volcanic explosion that brought a kind of a very short winter, year-long winter over the whole world. So yeah, it definitely was a very traumatic time for the people that were living through it.
Yep. And I like the way that you've been inching your way along. Is this book 16? Do I have that number right?
19. This is 19.
Well, I read them all. And I truly love them, but they don't, jump years or anything. They're moving quite a way, slowly along in the development of everybody's personal life, but also in terms of the political life. So we've arrived at July of 1815, and Waterloo, if I remember right, was fought in June of 1815. And, up until Waterloo, nobody really knew for sure how this 20-year-long war was going to come out. We forget that. Think of the anxiety, that people must have felt, even those who were not in Portugal, not in France. I mean, the war theater was not in England, but plenty of people were off fighting it in the Navy, fighting it on land, all the rest of it. So it's still unsettling. And I do think this one actually begins in 1801, doesn't it? I mean, the crime that we hark back to, actually, the first crime was in 1801. So it's been there. And I like the fact that Sir Henry Lovejoy, the magistrate, this is a very personal case for him rather than for Sebastian, whose personal life has gotten mixed up in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, this one, it's funny because from the very beginning, I knew that Lovejoy's wife and daughter had been murdered, but I never mentioned it because Sebastian didn't know it. So I kind of had to keep it to myself um, until I felt like it was right to finally bring it out and bring him some kind of closure to the whole event. Yeah.
So what was the crime that happened in 1801?
Well, his wife and daughter were murdered in a very bizarre fashion when they were on a picnic, and their bodies were posed as if they were like statues on a monument, on a medieval funerary monument. Like they used to pose them laid out with their hands together as if in prayer. And so he had always thought that the man who committed the murders had been hanged. And then in 1815 there's this other murder of a woman and her teenage daughter, who are posed in the same way in almost exactly the same spot. And so it makes him wonder, well, was the right man hanged after all, or is this a copycat? What's the connection between them?
Right. And so the scene of the crime is not in London per se, but in Richmond Park, right?
Yes, yeah, which was a ways outside of London at that time.
So there's a park keeper, wasn't he? I mean,
They did have park keepers, yeah, but it was a big park. It was originally a royal park that was thrown open a century or two before to the people, and it was about an hour's drive at the time from London,
right.
in a carriage.
Well, because it was a park, there weren't tons of people around, although there were other people on the occasion here in 1815, other people picnicking or otherwise, enjoying the park. But there's not a lot of witnesses involved here. And so you have to sort of ask, what was everyone in the park? What were they doing? Were they there having fun? Were they there committing crimes, whatever? And one of the things that's so interesting is that you created this wonderful character who functions as your forensics team, so to speak, Paul. And it's surprising how much he can figure out, despite the fact that medical science was still not terribly well developed.
And it's a fine line to walk between making sure I don't overstep what he could have deduced at the time, because there was still so much that they didn't know. They had no ability to detect poisons, for instance, no real ability that would stand up in court. And so Paul Gibson was at one time a surgeon in the army. And so he draws on the fact that he has seen a lot of bodies on battlefields. And also he performs dissections and studies this sort of thing on the sly, because of course he was having to buy bodies from body snatchers in order to do it. So I try to keep it true to the historical period. So that's one of the things I think that I enjoy about historical mysteries, is that there's a lot that forensics can't tell them, so they have to fall back on old-fashioned detecting.
Well, they do have to, although there've been some mysteries written with apothecaries as sleuths or consultants or something, and I've always been sort of surprised how much some of them actually knew about at least common poisons. Maybe something tricky would be beyond them, but usually they were pretty good, I thought, on arsenic and other stuff, because they, saw a lot of it.
Yeah, well, they couldn't, I think that I can't remember the exact date, but it was after that the first detection of poison was allowed to be introduced in a court case. It was in France.
Right. Well, no, I'm not saying it. I guess what I was saying is, practically speaking, they could maybe work it out, even if they couldn't, take it into court. But I'm sure there were people murdered often who, and their killer got away with it because it looked as though they were just ill or died in their sleep or whatever. But you have given Paul, you are actually looking at addiction in this series in the person of Paul Gibson, and it's very dramatic. I keep hoping that he's finally going to try to figure out some way to overcome it. So what's the source of his pain, and what possible ways of coping with it exist?
Well, he lost his leg in the war, had it the lower part of his leg shot off by a cannonball. So he's been dealing with phantom pains, which can be excruciating and still aren't entirely understood. Sometimes they go away after, just a few weeks or months, but sometimes they become so debilitating that, excuse me, that people will like commit suicide just to get away from the pains. And so he was taking the morphine to deal with the pains and has become addicted to the morphine, opium. Increasingly addicted to it, to where he's now taking very high doses, and this does play is a theme throughout this book, is because both the woman he loves and Sebastian have both been trying to get Paul Gibson to she has an idea for a mirror box, which is something that totally did not exist at that time. They didn't come up with it until in the last 20 or 30 years, but it's just simply a box with mirrors. So I figured, well, she could, if she was clever, she could come up with this idea. So that she's been trying to get him to try it. It basically tricks the mind into seeing that the leg is still there in the reflection in the mirror. She's been trying to get him to do it
because she's really fascinating.
And she knows that he's not going to be able to get off the morphine until he gets rid of the phantom pains. So it does play a big part in this book.
It does. No, I think it's fascinating. And since, you're rolling along, I'm assuming that we will see some evidence of how it works for him in the next. You can't really afford to lose him. So at some point, you're going to have to find a way to either cure him or at least get him to, in some kind of a maintenance thing. But, it's surprising how many people actually had addictions then and still functioned. Women in particular, I think, were often, dosing themselves with laudanum and other things. There were so many aches and pains, and we didn't even get aspirin until 1924 or something. So alcohol was one, tried and true remedy, but there's no question that people did take drugs in one form or another to try to tough it out.
Laudanum was very common, and there wasn't a recognition, or at least there was a recognition, but it wasn't, the warnings weren't there, so that I think a lot of people, I suspect, got addicted to it without realizing what they were falling into.
Yeah. Well, we all know that patent medicine, was either mostly alcohol or mostly dope or something, but it appeared not to be. Anyway, so the victim are Lady McGinnis and her daughter, Emma. So who are they?
Well, the Lady McGinnis is a friend of Hero's, so that Hero becomes involved because of her knowledge of both of her friend and of the people her friend was working with. And she was very unhappily married to a nobleman that was, her father had gone had lost a lot of money, and so he married her to this nobleman whom she really didn't want to marry. And so she's been unhappily married, and she was sort of pouring herself into what I guess we could call good works, although she tried to keep it sort of as quiet as she could because he didn't agree with what she was doing. So that she was involved in those, like apprentices and the baby farming and things like that, which of course Hero has also dealt with.
Right. So her husband is the sort of obvious suspect, except he wasn't there. But there are certainly other people. There doesn't seem to be any particularly visible motive for killing this woman and her daughter in that place and posing them in that way. But since Hero wants Sebastian to look into it. That's another thing. Sebastian's not an actual policeman, right? He's an aristocrat with time on his hand and lots of curiosity and the whole bit. So there has to be some reason for him to keep getting involved in investigations. Hero's father, tell us about Lord Jarvis, because he's been kind of an eminence Grise, if nothing else, maybe not Rouge. I always go back to Dumas and the Three Musketeers, and the Éminence Rouge and the Éminence Grise, who were these sinister church figures in the background. I think of Lord Jarvis as the Grise rather than the Rouge.
And he's a person who did not exist. I'm always having people say, is he modeled after someone? And it's like, no, he really didn't exist in that monarchy, but it was a fairly typical position in monarchies for centuries, where you had a monarch, in this case the regent, who is weak, and they have the power behind the throne, somebody who's smart and manipulative and basically handles things behind the curtain. He's the man behind the curtain. And that's Jarvis's role. He's a distant cousin of the Prince Regent. And he's a very Machiavellian character, very dedicated to the monarchy, to the expansion of British power in the world. So he's not an evil figure in that sense, but he definitely is an evil figure in the fact that he's very ruthless and he kills people all the time and doesn't hesitate to do it.
Right. Well, you had, if I remember right, Hero's mother was became a sickly person. And I thought for a while there was some suspicion that Lord Jarvis might well have had his wife killed or after himself. And then he's taken up with a young woman, Hero's friend, and he's now married to her and she's now pregnant. I wondered if you were ever going to develop that idea that Jarvis maybe got his wife out of the way.
That's coming.
Aha.
I think that will be 2017.
Well, I mean,
not that's 1817. The book set in 1817.
I understand what you meant, right? So yeah, I mean, Hero has an interesting relationship with her father. He has no real use for Devlin and has often tried to thwart Devlin or whatever. Hero married him anyway, and she also does things that her father does not approve of in terms of social work and all the rest of it. But up until now, she's been his only child. And so I'm wondering, if this new child is a boy or even a girl, but particularly a boy, whether Hero's relationship with her father will change. So
it's going to introduce a new dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely true. And we did have for a long time in this wonderful series, we had a tricky relationship because Sebastian and his own father have some really major issues. Well, he has more than one father, so that probably explains why there are numerous issues. But they've kind of come by now to something of a modus vivendi. When you started this series, Candace, did you not intend, or did you intend Sebastian and his first love to work things out, or did you always have the idea that Hero was going to? I've never been sure how you developed it, whether it was intentional or whether it just seemed like a better idea as you wrote the series.
It was intentional. I had never intended him to end up with Cat Boleyn, who was his lover at the very beginning. And I took a lot of grief for it. I had a whole team Cat, team Hero dynamic going, and some people were really outraged when the way it turned out. But I always felt like Cat had refused to marry him for so long because she knew it would be harmful to his social standing. And I could never see her changing her mind. It's the kind of thing that would happen in a romance. But I was going to have to keep, the story wasn't going to end at the last page of that book. It was going to have to keep going on. And I didn't want to have to deal with, with him being ostracized from society, apart from the fact that, and I think there is with the Regency romances, there's this, they can get away with the idea that a man can marry someone so much below him and be accepted into society, but that really, the woman never really was accepted. And so I couldn't see I mean, she wasn't going to be able to continue on the stage, and so what was she going to do? So, just sit home. So and I like the dynamic with Hero.
Mhm.
It,
Well, Hero opens up paths that he could never have followed without it. I mean, the Gunning sisters, who, for those who don't know, are a pair of Irish sisters who did enter into society. They made terrific marriages. I don't even know why. I mean, I don't know if they were spectacularly beautiful or what the hell happened, but one of them at least married a duke. And you know, but you do have to wonder if they ever really fit in, you
well,
know.
and they weren't that, lowly born. I think their father was a vicar, if I remember correctly, but they had contacts in the upper class, whereas Kat was a bastard. She was a legitimate child.
Mm.
And she'd been on the stage and she had had lovers and was well known to have had lovers. So it was a completely different and dynamic.
Sure. Well, for the long-term run of the series, absolutely, Hero was going to be. And I've really, we didn't necessarily like Hero when we first met her, but I think we've all grown to, at least I have, to really admire her. I mean, she's just the right wife for Sebastian. She's pregnant again, so you have to always worry because pregnancy was so risky, in those days. But she's a big woman and she appears to be built maybe for childbirth just from the descriptions. Well, I mean, there are body types that deal more easily with childbirth, and from your descriptions of her, she's pretty Juno-esque. So
She's a big woman. She had trouble with her first because it was breech and it
right.
wouldn't turn. But so Sebastian is of course worried again because he
Yeah.
did almost lose her. But yeah, she is built. And with the first pregnancy, I don't know how many books she was pregnant in. I was really tired of being pregnant.
All right. Well, but that's what's interesting. The great thing about writing historical fiction is that since the time has already elapsed, you can literally start a new book the day after, or a new case the day after the old one ends. So you don't have that pressure of, trying to do things in real time. And so she did stay pregnant, you're right, for a while, but that was okay because the cases were moving along, at a fairly slow rate. And, the idea of the gentleman sleuth, it does take a private income and it does take some sort of social status where you can move. I mean, Sebastian, for example, would not be the ideal person to like go down into the kitchen to talk to the cook, but he does have servants that he can, so there's a whole upstairs, downstairs kind of a thing, that you have to allow for too. I'm trying to remember. It's his groom, isn't it? The young man.
Yes, yeah, Tom, his
Uh-huh.
type. Yeah, it was one of the reasons why when I first started thinking about writing a mystery series set in the Regency period, I toyed with the character of the protagonist, and I finally decided I really wanted somebody at the higher levels of society because you can go down, but you can't go up when it comes to approaching people and accusing them and interviewing them or whatever. So Sebastian can go in gentlemen's clubs. He can go in balls, which is something that someone who was like a Bow Street runner couldn't do, or
Mhm.
someone who was more common birth. But then because he has his military background and he's young and strong, he can also, don a disguise and go down on the docks or go into the slums to go after people too. So he gives me the ability to look at the whole range of Regency society rather than just the upper class or just the lower class.
Oh, absolutely. And Hero can do that too. I mean, she could actually, given her build, she can even disguise herself as a man and, go down, which, was right. Anyway, this particular case is really quite a dark one. And Sir Henry Lovejoy, who has been in this series all along, I think it was interesting to see him and, dealing with his family tragedy and also his own, because he's a man that does like justice and his own worries about whether, in fact, the wrong person had been hanged for the murder of his wife and child. I think this one has an unusually horrifying resolution. And it's a good reminder that, you know, killers come in all types.
Yeah, I think that's probably why I stopped writing it the first time, because I couldn't see where couldn't grasp where the arc was taking me. And it is the ending is traumatic. It was hard to write. Usually I find sometimes my books I don't have trouble writing them, but then when I reread them, I think, oh yeah, that's dark. But this one the ending was kind of hard to write.
Yeah, but it certainly fits the story, and explains all the things. Candace's books always wrap everything up. You know, she's not one to leave threads dangling, or you're going, wait, what happened here, or something. I think they're complicated. There are many threads, but they do all come together. I like a quote from one of the reviewers. I think it was probably Kirkus, who said, "Far from the charming world of Regency romances, this thorny mystery is a powerful expose of privilege and inequality." And this is one where I think that's very true.
Well, it's funny because it's not like I set out to do that.
That's the way the story came out.
That's just the way the story came out.
Yeah.
Because it was such a tremendous contrast. It's one of those periods in history when there was a huge contrast between the poor and the wealthy.
So in the course of this series, Sebastian has had to confront questions of his parentage, and we've wrapped up most of it. I'm not sure there's not one thread sort of dangling out there in relation to a potential sibling, and don't tell me because I don't want to know. But part of this has been working out the mysteries of Sebastian's own life. Hero, we know, who her parents were and all the rest of it. But Sebastian has a complex personal story, as does his family, and he has a sister who hates him and who is really a perfectly awful person. So, I have to say every once in a while, I hope something will happen to her because she's such an ungenerous woman. But at the same time, women didn't have, what's the right word we're now using? Agency, isn't that it? But anyway, women had to put up with an awful lot. And I think the sister, are you writing her in part because she's angry that as a woman, she just doesn't have the same kind of, powers that the men do?
That's one of the main things that drove her, was because she's the firstborn, and if she had been a man, or if the laws of male primogeniture hadn't existed, she would have inherited everything, and instead she got a portion and she was married off. So that was something, and it's just the personality that she was born with.
Yeah.
And no, she's a character that she plays a large role in the first book.
Mm-hmm.
And she's hard for Sebastian to adjust, because he's not to the reality of her, because she is his sister, his half sister, he eventually realizes. But she really is a malevolent soul that he has a hard time grasping just how malevolent she really is.
Right. Well, I'm assuming at some point as we move along, there will be developments related to the sister. By this book, isn't she a widow?
She is. Yeah, she has been for quite some time. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I know at some point that her husband had died, which means that she's kind of a loose cannon out there, if nothing else, the potential for remarriage to somebody equally horrible possibly exists. So who knows? But I do like what you've done to the Earl of Henshaw, Sebastian's, father. I think he's developed in really interesting ways and is a much better person than he appeared to be at the outset.
Yeah, I was kind of bemused when people didn't like Hendon at the beginning, because in a lot of ways I had modeled him on my own husband. So it was like, but wait, I like Hendon. It's he's very conservative. Not that my husband is conservative in that way, but a lot of his characteristics and other aspects of him are modeled on Steve. So he was a very conservative man, but his heart's in the right place. He's an honorable man. He's a good man, and he raised Sebastian as his own, even though he knew that he wasn't. And and became to love him and admire him, even though he knew he wasn't his son, and has fiercely stood up for him and tried to protect him and worried about him all the years he was in the army, off at war, risking getting killed. So there's a very
Well, yeah, but there's a lot of irony in that his two older boys, who were his older boys, have died, and so here's Sebastian, now the heir to the earldom and the whole bit. And, you have to wonder whether the earl wouldn't have liked one of his actual descendants but I think he's become reconciled to the idea. And now that Hero is pregnant again, there's another generation coming. So I'm sure that people had to be pragmatic. I mean, there were lots of sexual liaisons and so forth, and there were probably lots of children. Well, there definitely were, not probably, lots of children whose parentage was not what you might have assumed. And it was easier if the woman produced the illegitimate child for the father to adopt it than because primogeniture was such a big deal. But I'm sure there were men who concealed the true parentage of sons too, as a result.
Well, a lot of times when they knew the child wasn't the woman's, they would just take the child away and just, give her, give the child to be some, basically denied. The woman would go away, have the child, they wouldn't even admit that she had it.
Right. Well, there were baby farms, and there were, places women would, quote, travel on the continent or vacation in the lakes, or, whatever it might happen to be. But, there wasn't much in the way of birth control and contraception and all of that. So, and people had pretty robust sex lives, many of them. So, it's not entirely clear. Francine Matthews, in one of her, not her Jane Austen book, but as Stephanie Barrett, wrote a really fascinating book about Queen Victoria and whether she actually was the daughter of that son of George III, because where did the hemophilia actually come from? There was no evidence of it anywhere in that family, and yet the mother of Victoria was a widow and probably had a lover. And they know where the lover is buried. I mean, there was some evidence of it. So the question is, would anybody ever really want to, open up the tomb and do genetic testing and discover if in fact that was true? But I mean, there is some chance that I always thought it was a great thesis, because you can't figure out the hemophilia, which is a hereditary disease.
Well, except that it can develop spontaneously and when you have an older father. And so I think that's because if you look at the pictures of the father, the real, is it William? I can't remember. No, it wasn't William.
No, it wasn't William. It was another brother.
It was another one. But if you look at pictures of him when he was young and then look at Victoria when she was young, they actually do look a lot.
Do they?
Yeah.
So that's a neat idea, regardless, it'll probably never be proved. So
it was a great story idea, though.
It was. That was a terrific story idea. Indeed, it was. So I don't have a copy of Candace's book to show you. Patrick did, but I went back to my shelf because I've always been addicted to books of this period. And I don't know, Candace, if you've ever run across J.G. Jeffries, whose original book called The Thief Taker. My uncle absolutely adored these books and gave me his set. And we're in 1798, a robust and exciting period, elegant, sordid, colorful and drab, intensely patriotic, but unruly. The rise of Napoleon was a big background. And Jeremy Sturrock is roughly based on a real Bow Street runner of that time, a man named Townsend, who had much the same background, who was appointed one of the two bodyguards to King George III and eventually become famous and wealthy. And the runner, so he's written, I think there's 6 or 7 books about Jeremy Sturrock, the Bow Street runner. And so if you like Candace's books, I recommend you find them. The first one's called The Thief Taker, and the second one is called A Wicked Way to Die. And then there's some others. You probably can find them as used books. They were published by Walker, which was a small mystery publisher that did some really nifty stuff. And unfortunately, like many small publishers, no longer exists, but they published a lot of, I thought, fascinating mysteries, and they like series. So there was a ancient Egyptian one, and there's, great place to go for historical mystery. But I really recommend it. It's Jeffreys, Jeffreys, JG. So if I can find you a copy of The Thief Taker, I'm not going to give you mine. I will send it to you. You can't
I
have
would like to
it,
see it.
because I want to reread them. But honestly, I've been reading this, Regency Bow Street Runners. Remember, oh, Bruce, I'm trying to think of his last name.
Alexander, Bruce Alexander.
Yes,
Was-
thank you. Who also wrote, it's England, the formation of an actual police force was a long time coming. It was what, 1830 or 1832 or something.
29, I think,
Is
yeah.
that it? Okay.
Yeah. It because there was this idea that they would encroach upon the traditional British freedoms, and they did in the end. I mean, they played it. Actually, the development of the police force plays a part in my next book, number
Oh, yeah.
20.
Wow.
Yes, which I've just turned in,
Oh,
and there's a lot of talk in that book about why they need it and why people are afraid of having a police force, and they did actually use it at first to go after they became kind of a morals police. They didn't even at first, which seems incredible since we think of Scotland Yard as being detectives. At first they didn't have a detective force. They thought if they just had uniformed police people, crime would just go away. And then that didn't happen, so they had to, now we need a detective force.
right. Well, I mean, they did have, a long-standing kind of a coroner jury, system, in which there would be inquests when there were crimes. And, they also had a hue and cry system, back in the Middle Ages, maybe even earlier than that, to go after. But detection, I mean, it was hard to do detection when there was no forensics or no, it was really hard to investigate crimes.
Well, and at the time and during the Regency period, magistrates like Lovejoy actually had an investigative role.
Mhm.
And that was one of the things that the 1829, when they brought in the police force, they took away from the magistrates that function and made them purely judicial.
They did,
And
unlike the French, whose magistrates, if you watch any contemporary French crime drama, which I watch a lot on MHC TV because they're really well done, they still have an investigative role. So, and but they have a different presumption anyway. It's more a presumption of guilt until proved innocent than innocent until proved guilty. Yeah, but the British, you're right. The British have always really wanted to defend personal freedoms. They're a pretty rambunctious group on the whole.
evidently they were really rambunctious in those days.
Well, I think they always were. They have a very tangled bloodline. I mean, if you go back and look, the Vikings, the Danes, the Anglo-Saxons, the Celts, all the rest of it. There's a lot of warrior tribes, savage tribes, lots of. I just had a discussion before your event with another author who's written a modern version of Henry VIII and the Six Wives. It's a very, very, very clever book with Hank Tudor, the billionaire entrepreneur of Tudor Enterprises, as the figure. I think it's extremely clever, but I mean, it's a damn soap opera. If you go look the whole thing from, William the Conqueror on, if you look at it, the number of murders, the number of, adulteries, the number of disputes, the number of whatever, the English history is really unruly.
Yeah, I remembered. I think it was during the pandemic. I read a book that was like the kings and queens of England, and it just who I've studied in the isolation, but this book just went through one after the other, and I, having never looked at them that way, it's like, oh, wow, these people were really ruthless with each other. They murdered all kinds of family members in order to take the
They
throne.
did, and they were sexually pretty rambunctious also. And I thought about it today. The Washington Post has an interesting article about the younger brother of the new king of Denmark, and he is in Washington doing good work. But the article in the Post is really intriguing about the role of younger sons in, in their mother, Queen Margareta, who just abdicated or, in favor of her older son, took away the titles of the younger son's children and so forth. It was a big discussion about it, but a lot of it had to do with the dignity and the, relatively clean lives of so many monarchs. And then the British, I mean, right now even are just as embroiled in scandal and all the rest of it as they've ever been, I mean, they just seem to have a monarchy and an aristocracy that does not, not addicted to clean living or whatever you want to call it. It's fascinating. So I think it's a cultural thing in part, that maybe Denmark just wouldn't put up with this kind of behavior, but the British seem to do it, and wow. Anyway, I'm glad to hear there's going to be a book 20. Now, if it's really book 20, we have to figure out some way to make a celebration for it, whether you come here or maybe I have to go to Texas. I don't know how we're going to do this, but don't you think?
Hopefully I'll be able to travel by next year. I am getting better.
Okay. Well, now that you're out of the swamp, the swamps of Louisiana, we'll see if that's a healthier environment. But seriously, that's a really significant thing to have written 20 books that, have never lost their momentum, they're all fabulous. You never phone them in. I mean, as you know, I'm a tremendous fan, but I think that's an astonishing achievement, Candace.
Well, I certainly never expected it. When I first started, I envisioned maybe doing 8 books because that was I had sort of the idea for the story arc, and I thought I'd cover it in maybe 8 books, which was crazy because of course I didn't begin to
You barely got started. I know.
I don't know what I was thinking, but because I still haven't, there are still a few questions about Sebastian's father that need to be answered.
Oh, yes, there's Sebastian's father. There's, Sebastian's brother that we think is dead. There's, Hero's mother. There's all I mean, I think the thing is that you created such astonishing characters with such depth and whatever that their lives just keep propelling you forward. I mean, I read them for the investigations and the crimes. That's true. But the real reason I read them largely is to continue with the lives of these characters. So, you created them or conceived them in just a brilliant way. And I have a feeling that they probably carry you along at this point as much as you write them.
They do. I think to a certain extent they do. Yeah. I like to take a break and write other things, but I always like to come back to them too, because I miss them and I'm not writing about them for too long.
Well, that's one reason I always ask you what the next book is. I want to leave this knowing that book 20 is going to come, and maybe you'll start on book 21. Patrick, are you there? Do you want to see if we have questions from the audience?
Sure thing.
Notice that I stuck to the topic in this discussion as opposed to the last event when we were off into virtual, doorbells and virtual crimes and all kinds of stuff. It was so funny.
It was entertaining though.
It was great.
Well, actually I have a question for you. I'm sure you get asked this quite a bit, but when did you decide in the series to stick with the W beginning? Because I think I was just looking at the titles, and this is the 5th with what, and then there are a number with who,
and why.
And why. Yeah. How did you get not stuck with, but decided on that convention?
It was when I was writing the very first book, when I thought there would only be 8. And I had the titles for the first 4 books. It just sort of came to me. I remember I was sitting by the fire one day and I thought, well, I could call this one What Angels Fear, and then, the first 4. And then I realized, oh, I've kind of I've got this going. I have to keep it going. And I never thought I'd be going, of course, for 20 books. And I'd have to admit that I do keep a list of, okay, how many whats do I have and how many whys? The next one's going to be a who. It's yeah, it gets harder. Sometimes with the book, I'll think, oh, I just can't come up with another one. But in the end, I do.
Well, it's the old newspaper thing, who, what, where, when, why. So it isn't as though there's not a precedent for all of that. And I should mention too, and I'll give a shout out to Candace's publisher, Berkeley. All of these books are in print, and that is not necessarily true for a long-running series anymore. But you can actually start with the first book and read your way, in case you happen to have missed it. And then you have a whole summer now coming where you can binge on this, but you can actually read your way right through the whole series, which I think is great. They have gone, however, from the little paperbacks, which are called mass market in the trade, to the larger paperbacks. So that part has changed, but at least they're all there.
Yeah, they are. They kept them in print.
Yeah. So
All the same
and what
publisher
that-
too.
Yeah, and what that also says is that people are buying them. Because after all, the publisher, is not a charitable institution. So clearly there are enough readers who are buying the backlist that it's profitable for them to continue to keep them going. So I would never asked you about audiobooks because I don't care about audiobooks, but I assume, are there audiobooks?
There are, yes. They picked it up sort of late I think around 7 or 8, and then they went back and did the earlier ones. And I had the same reader, Davina Porter, for I think the first 16 of them, and then she retired. So it was the first 6, I can't remember. But I had another reader who then, now I think she died, if I remember correctly. So the book that's coming out, I think it comes out next week, has a new reader once again. So yeah, there are audiobooks.
Oh, good.
Isn't
Well,
Davina
that's
Porter
really good to know.
Diana's, Barbara?
What?
Isn't Davina Porter, isn't she Diana's audiobook reader?
Yeah, she is.
I honestly don't know because once again, audiobooks are so far out of my daily realm. I don't
Candace,
pay any.
that's right, isn't it?
It is, yes. I don't know if she still reads Diana's or not, but she retired from reading most other things, at least.
Mhm.
But
Well, we do know that readers get attached to the narrators of audiobooks. They really, I know my husband absolutely loved the man that did the Harry Potter books. He thought, he didn't want to read the books. He only wanted to listen to them because he was so mesmerized by the narrator.
Yeah, I'm not an audiobook listener myself. For some reason, it allows my mind to wander too much in a way that reading a book doesn't.
Well, I read so fast, I can't listen as fast as I read. And so an audiobook drives me almost nuts, because I'm way over here. Yeah.
That
So
might be
I
part
just
of
don't do
it. They are slow. They do read slow.
what if
Well,
they
they
sped
should.
it up? What if they sped it up, Barbara? Like,
Well, Rob actually does set his up just a little bit, but there is no way that people can talk as fast as I read. It's also the reason you might probably figured this out why I have such terrible handwriting. My hand can't keep up with the speed at which I'm going, and so really typing is what set me free. Because I really have terrible handwriting. I've never been able to slow down my mind fast to keep up with my hand.
Well, let's see. Okay, there is a good question here, which I just lost. Here we go. Ashley says, I love your books, history and mystery, strong, independent women characters, and much more. I'm wondering how your books are received in England and France.
I never have actually sold the series to France, which is interesting because they bought all of my romances that I wrote as Candace Proctor, but they haven't bought this series. And it hasn't been picked up by a British publisher, so it is available, but it's not
American import.
It's an American import, although the company that is looking at developing the television series is British.
Ooh, television series. Oh, tell us more.
Well, it's one of those things that I've been told, and it's true. They drag out forever, and I don't know whether it will actually happen, but it's still in the works.
Well, they're incredibly expensive, but the good news is that Bridgerton did so well that it may have created something of an appetite. I'm going to London at the end of May to Capital Crimes, and I'm having um, lunch, not in a professional, sort of professional way, with some publishers. You know what? I'm going to take your first book with me.
Oh, thank you.
You bet.
Because I get
why
all
not?
kinds of complaints from British readers about how hard it is to get the book over there.
Well, they're truly wonderful. And I do think the British can quarrel with any, because they can be picky about people not really understanding their culture and all, but I think that you understand it better than some British authors that I have read. So there we go. Sorry for anybody watching it who now feels insulted, but I actually do think that's true.
You didn't name names.
No, I'm not naming names.
Andrea just came in with a question. She says, I have a big crush on Sebastian. Do you have a model in mind when you write him?
I don't. I see him in my mind, but that's why whenever anyone suggests actors and I look at their suggestions, I think, oh no, he doesn't look like that. So if they ever do cast a series, it's just going to be whoever they pick. As long as they pick somebody handsome and sexy and strong, that'll be good with me.
Do you describe him very much?
I describe him as lean, and he's dark, and he has high cheekbones, yellow eyes, and
It's
slight.
the eyes. It's going to need an actor who can wear contacts because Sebastian's yellow eyes, sort of like Lion, are a big part of the mystery of who he is and his genetic makeup and so forth. So you definitely have to have yellow eyes.
Yeah, contacts.
Let's see. Anybody else questions? Ivana says, I liked the resolution to Cat and Hero. This entire series keeps to the realism of the times, and that was the right way to settle that for me. So she gives her thumbs up.
Well, they're not romances. I mean, Candace made that point early on, and it's really true. She's not writing Regency romance, where that kind of thing, that bridging the classes or something maybe would work out. But Sebastian never could pursue the life that he's portrayed as having in this series if he had married Cat. And worse than that, Cat would have been miserable.
Yeah.
I agree, that there would have been no real life for her. She's an actress, she is, and if she'd married Sebastian and suddenly became, eventually would wind up as a countess, none of that would have been possible for her.
Yeah, and I just couldn't see her doing it. She'd refused for so long. I just couldn't see her finally deciding,
Didn't they kind of mirror that with the oldest son in Bridgerton? Remember in the first one, he was having this really robust affair with a woman who's an actress, but then when it comes time to get married, I think I didn't watch anything but the first season. But I was mesmerized by the clothes, so whatever. But I'm pretty sure that that romance has to be put aside when he comes to looking for a wife. But then the wife, because they brought in a kind of whole multiracial cast, was equally improbable.
Yeah, I didn't actually watch it, so
Right.
I don't.
The clothes were fabulous. Season 1. Great sex too, but the clothes are astonishing. So it was worth watching it just for that. Right. Anything else, Patrick? Or
there's a question just about who are some of your favorite authors? Who do you like to read?
I like James Lee Burke, although I have to admit I prefer his Robichaud series to his other ones. I like John Connolly, the Irish writer, although his books are so dark.
Really?
I have to really be in the right mood, and I certainly can't read one after the other because but he's a beautiful, beautiful writer. I've never known anyone who could introduce a character, make you fall in love with that character, know him and care about him so much in 2 pages, and then just turn around and do something awful to him, on the third page. He's a great actor, but great writer, but he's very dark. I like Martin Cruz Smith.
Yeah.
His Arcady ones more than his standalone historicals. Those are probably the people that are still writing that are my favorites.
Good list.
Yeah. That's about it as far as questions.
All right. Well, Candace, as ever, it's been a pleasure to spend an hour with you. Now I'm going to start plotting what we're going to do for book 20. I don't want to zoom on book 20. But anyway, what cannot be said? Candace very kindly signed batch for us, and I think we're down to under 10 copies by now because they always sell so well. If you've never read her, I really do recommend. It is not always true, but I would recommend you start at the beginning, that you don't start here in book 19, because there's just so many things that are kind of spoilers, not for the cases, but for the characters and what happens to them. If you come in on them this late, it will spoil a lot of the suspense deriving from the characters and their lives if you don't start with book 1. So fortunately, we can sell them. We can sell you the whole set. Think about Mother's Day. Yeah, you can give your mom 18 paperbacks and then a hardcover. Why not? Anyway, thanks very much, honey. It's great to see you. Thanks for signing the book.